History as it happens, February 23rd, 2023. 1 year of war, part 2.
NATO can do for Europe's east what it did for Europe's west.
Russia has tended to view the expansion of freedom and democracy as a threat to its interests.
In recent months, as the citizens of Ukraine have made their voices heard, we have been guided by a fundamental principle. The future of Ukraine must be decided by the people of Ukraine.
After months of preparations, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine.
We are in the midst of a fundamental debate about the future and direction of our world. We're at an inflection point between those who argue that given all the challenges we face, from the fourth industrial revolution to a global pandemic, that autocracy is the best way forward. They are.
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul.
A year after many expected a quick Russian victory, including Vladimir Putin himself, Ukraine fights on for its independence, for the principle of defense of national territory, and according to some folks in the West, for the survival of democracy itself. With neither side apparently ready to negotiate, a long war seems to be in the offing. And no one can say for sure where this is going or how far the U.S. might go to save Ukraine. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
These are the sort of issues for which countries do in fact risk an enormous amount. And as a Russian acquaintance said to me, and he, by the way, was no admirer of Putin, he said, look, America would in the last resort use nuclear weapons to defend Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, and we should do the same for Crimea and Sevastopol.
This is the second part of my 2-episode series on the anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I'll dispense with my usual preamble before the interviews here, because I discussed origins of the war and questions about what are national interests in part 1 a couple days ago, so I hope you seek out and listen to that episode too. Briefly, though, I have been thinking about Barack Obama's interview with The Atlantic 7 years ago. You may remember he said Ukraine is not a core U.S. interest, but it is a Russian one. This was near the end of his presidency. He poo-pooed the idea of going to war with Russia over something like Ukraine's sovereignty. At a news conference a couple years before that, around the time Russia annexed Crimea, Obama sounded like he wanted to move past old Cold War European-focused thinking of opposing power blocks to deal with other challenges, like his pivot to Asia.
America's got a whole lot of challenges. Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness. Ukraine has been a country in which Russia had enormous influence for decades, since the breakup of the Soviet Union. We have considerable influence on our neighbors. We generally don't need to invade them in order to have a strong cooperative relationship with them. The fact that Russia felt compelled to go in militarily and lay bare these violations of international law indicates less influence, not more.
Well, here we are in 2023, and Obama's old vice president is now in charge of U.S. foreign policy. And to Joe Biden, defending Ukraine is in U.S. interests because the argument goes its fate is tied to the stability of the liberal world order. The rules-based order that, it must be said, the U.S. has kicked aside when inconvenient, as in Iraq in 2003. Anyway, here's Biden.
Democracy is essential to meeting these challenges. Historians are going to examine and write about this moment as an inflection point, as I said. And I believe that every ounce of my being that democracy will and must prevail. We must demonstrate that democracy can still deliver for our people in this changed world.
We will reflect on the past year of war in Eastern Europe and what lies ahead with Anatol Lieven of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. But first, we're going to check in with the Washington Times' Ben Wolfgang. He's been reporting on Putin's potential political problems from the Russian right. You can find his report this week at WashingtonTimes.com. Ben, hello.
It's a pleasure to be here as always. Thank you, Martin.
You've been covering this war for 1 year now. There is no end in sight. What has surprised you about the past year?
There's a lot of things that have surprised me. I think if I had to pinpoint one, it's that, if you had asked me in the early days of the war what the trajectory was, how the West was going to approach it with respect to eventually getting to an end, it seems like we're farther away from an end, farther away from ceasefire negotiations than maybe we were, even last May, June, July, heading into the Ukrainian counteroffensive. It's been interesting to me to watch the shift in the Biden administration's talking points and rhetoric about ceasefire negotiations and diplomacy, finding an end to this war at the negotiating table. That seems to be less of a focus now than it was in the early months of the war. And I think I probably would have predicted the opposite if we had had this conversation at this time last year.
So when it comes to determining what is going on inside the Kremlin or in Vladimir Putin's head, we all need to approach that subject with a degree of humility. We don't really know. Even experts can't say for sure what's happening there. Your piece deals with pressure on Putin's right. What is going on there?
One more time to kind of rewind back to the beginning of this conflict. We all remember, I know you do, Martin, that the early days of the war, Senator Lindsey Graham said that somebody needed to take Putin out, sort of a palace coup inside the Kremlin, because that was the only way that we were going to see an end to the war in Ukraine. That he was a madman, he was out of control, somebody needed to take him down from the inside to end this. That now the idea of Putin being killed, deposed, beheaded by an angry Russian mob, whatever the case may be, is actually probably a be careful what you wish for situation, because you might end up with somebody who is far, far worse, far more nationalist in their point of view, perhaps willing to use nuclear weapons, even more antagonistic toward NATO, certainly more antagonistic toward Ukraine, maybe willing to kill Zelensky. You have these right-wing figures that have always been there. These folks aren't new. Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, Gagosian, the head of the Wagner Group. These guys have been active, obviously, for years, decades. But their megaphone is bigger than it was before, because this is what they've been agitating Putin to do for years and years. So he's doing what they want, but the Russian military is not getting the results that they want so far in Ukraine. So that's leading to an opening for them politically to put more pressure on Putin. That pressure on Putin is often sort of disguised as pressure on the Russian military, on the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, for example. It's still pretty rare in Russian politics that you have folks coming out and naming Putin, explicitly and taking shots at him. But there's an undercurrent inside the Kremlin, inside the Russian populace right now, that the right wing is kind of ascendant and frustrated with what they're seeing. And Vladimir Putin, of course, that's no surprise to him. He's very well aware of that.
There is a Russian election coming up. Yeah. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, look, we had the brief period where Medvedev came in as, quote unquote, the president of Russia, but we've had going on 2.5 decades now of Vladimir Putin as the head of Russia. So a lot of folks, I'm 38 years old, so for most of my adult life, it's been Vladimir Putin. So the idea of someone different is a little bit hard to fathom, but we do in fact have an election coming up in March of 2024, which seems like a long way off. And we should caveat this, of course, by saying that elections in Russia are certainly not as free, fair, and open as they are in the United States or in the West. Having said that, if this frustration continues to build on the right, and you have somebody like a Gagosian, the head of a Wagner Group, who can point to actual successes that his mercenaries have had on the ground in places like Syria and Ukraine that maybe the Russian military hasn't, because his folks, quite frankly, are willing to oftentimes do more brutal, inhumane things that a lot of these 19-year-old Russian conscripts coming into battle for the first time aren't willing or able to do. If this war is still going poorly for Russia in the spring, in the summer, into the fall, when the election campaign really starts to heat up, I'm talking to folks, dissident Russian journalists, exiled Russian journalists, folks who study this region and are very familiar with the politics of it, who say this could be a unique election season in Russia where you might see someone move against Putin in domestic politics and say that this war has been a disaster for the past 18 months and maybe he's the reason why. He miscalculated the campaign to take Kyiv. He wasn't prepared. We didn't have the manpower. He should have been stockpiling drones and missiles from North Korea and Iran a year before the war, not scrambling to do it it as the war is actually unfolding. There are a lot of ways, if you were looking to run a quote-unquote Western-style re-election campaign against Vladimir Putin, there's starting to be a list of things that you could use, of ammunition that you could pull out and use against him. And I think we might see that if there's not a dramatic turn of Russia's fortunes over the next 6 months.
It's interesting listening to you because what you haven't said is that there is a peace movement, or, not a peace movement, but a movement on the Russian left.
Yeah.
Insofar it still exists, to declare victory and go home, say, this didn't work, it was a mistake, and it's time to approach foreign policy differently. And that is because, based on your reporting, a we must win sentiment. Not surprising, this happens in wars.
Yeah.
A we must win sentiment has seeped all through Russian politics.
And Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, who's still deeply entrenched in Vladimir Putin's inner circle, is an interesting figure in all of this. He talked to foreign policy analysts, people who have tracked his career. They will call him, again, these terms are relative, but a liberal, a quote-unquote liberal inside Russian politics. That's not really the case anymore, at least not with respect to the war in Ukraine. He's become one of the most vocal. He was one of the first, I believe, to raise the specter of nuclear warfare, or a nuclear retaliation by Russia against the West if they kept backing Ukraine. I don't think he's undergone a dramatic transformation in terms of his personal political beliefs or what have you. I think it's just a natural human response to the political pressure that's been put on him.
And do you agree that at this point, making this a frozen conflict and going back to the front lines of February 22nd, I think that was the day the war began.
24th.
Yeah, 24th, 2022, that in the Russian view, that would be seen not as just going back to where we started, but a defeat.
Absolutely. And that I think would be the end of Vladimir Putin's political career, for sure, because that would be too big of a weapon that the right-wing nationalists could bludgeon him with, to say that you've accomplished nothing except humiliating us on the global stage and killing tens of thousands of young Russian men.
You and Guy Taylor are working on a third piece in your series on the anniversary of the Russian invasion about the geopolitical ramifications of the war. Maybe some people in the West might be surprised, or have been surprised, that Russia was not universally condemned.
Right.
And even folks who weren't on board with the invasion also haven't cracked down on Russia with sanctions, like China, for instance. They're not really happy with what's going on in Ukraine, but they haven't taken the U.S. and the West, however we define that anymore, the West side in all of this. Briefly, what can you tell us about some of the geopolitical consequences?
Well, certainly we could spend hours talking about this, but you sort of hit the nail on the head. One of the things that's fascinating me the most is sort of this westernized, through no fault of our own, we see the world through our prism, and we look at it as, the West is united, the U.S. and NATO are so, the world's so united against Russia. That's not really true. When you actually look and if you start ticking country by country, we certainly don't have buy-in from China, don't have buy-in from Indonesia, don't have buy-in from South Africa, from Saudi Arabia. Even Israel is not on board. We have Naftali Bennett met with Vladimir Putin after the invasion had already taken place, which for a Western leader to do that, I think would seem kind of far-fetched. He did it. The world is not united against Russia. And a lot of countries are hedging their bets. I don't think a lot of countries are necessarily happy that Russia has upset the status quo, the global order, by potentially starting World War III in Europe. But there is not this mass condemnation across the globe that we see in the West, because people have different points of view depending on where you live, which isn't news, but it's something that I think we often forget about here.
But is it the natural resources they need from Russia,
That's
too?
That's part of it. I mean, certainly. Look, that's one of the reasons that we see such different attitudes toward China. I remember, interviewing Pakistani officials a number of years ago, and they got very animated when you talked to them about Belt and Road investments in Pakistan, because they said nobody else was willing to do it. Nobody else was willing to pour money into our country to build clean water systems or build dams or build energy plants, what have you. That's true. That's actually like a visceral reaction a lot of folks have around the world, not to speak for them, but that they have around the world to Russia and China, that those countries are actually able and willing to provide things that the United States, frankly, isn't, for better or worse, for whatever reason that may be. So this idea that everybody in the world is going to take the same U.S.-led moral stand against a Russian war of choice of aggression in Ukraine has not borne out, and I don't see any signs that it's going to in 2023.
Well, autocracy versus democracy makes for good propaganda, but we know that the world can't be
black and white.
Divided into two opposing factions like that. Yeah. Ben Wolfgang, thank you.
Absolutely. Pleasure as always.
Russia has tended to view the expansion of freedom and democracy as a threat to its interests. The opposite is true. Free and prosperous societies on Russia's borders will advance Russia's interests, by serving as sources of stability and economic opportunity.
Anatol Lieven is the director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He covered the anti-Soviet jihad in the 1980s and wars in Chechnya and the Southern Caucasus. And now he is a voice of reason in a world of military interventionism. Anatol Lieven, welcome back, my friend.
Hello, nice to be back.
Before you head to Ukraine, I'll mention, before I start peppering you with questions here, you're going to be going not up to the front line, but close to it?
I'll go wherever they will let me go. I just have to see once I get there. And, I shall obviously go and introduce myself to the relevant authorities and see what they can come up with.
So your old war journalism hat, you're putting that back on?
If I can. Understandably enough, the Ukrainians are pretty restrictive about where they let people go, so I'll have to see.
Some of our loyal listeners might remember that when I talked to you for the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we talked about your time covering the anti-Soviet jihad in the late 1980s. Amazing stuff. So, to the war in Europe. Anatol, I have you on a lot because I feel you're a real clear-eyed analyst with a historically informed point of view. You're not given to hyperbole. Then I read your recent essay in Jacobin. The greatest threat of nuclear catastrophe that humanity has ever faced is now centered on the Crimean Peninsula. What do you mean by that?
Next to the Cuban Missile Crisis, this does pose the greatest threat of escalation to nuclear war, simply because the Ukrainians have announced their determination to recover the Crimean Peninsula. The Russians regard it as simply their territory now. Large majority of Crimeans, it seems, also regard it part of Russia. It is strategically vital to Russia. Russians think that basically the loss of Crimea would end their status as a great power.
That's a geopolitical view, right? Because of the importance of the Black Sea to them.
Exactly, and the port of Sevastopol. Many analysts say that the loss of Crimea would also doom the Putin regime. These are the sort of issues for which countries do, in fact, risk an enormous amount. And as a Russian acquaintance said to me, and he, by the way, was no admirer of Putin, but he regards himself as, basically patriotically Russian. He said, look, America would in the last resort use nuclear weapons to defend Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, and we should do the same for Crimea and Sevastopol. That is the issue.
So Crimea is that important to the Russians? Should the Ukrainians actually try to take it back? I mean, they've talked about it, but there's no indication yet that they're actually going to go through with this, right?
Well, no, and I mean, that's the thing. Pray God, this never happens. But there was a leak, you may remember, in the New York Times a few weeks ago that clearly is what the Biden administration wanted to put out, saying that the administration wants to put the Ukrainians in a position credibly to threaten Crimea, basically in order to force the Russians to give up everything else, to compromise on surrender on everything else. But that the administration doesn't think that the Ukrainians could actually capture Crimea. Well, that's a very, very, very delicate, maneuver to conduct. It depends on your analysis being right. It depends on convincing the Russians of something that you, it seems, don't actually believe. It depends on the Ukrainians not being able to capture Crimea. And, of course, it depends on, if they are capable of attacking Crimea, it depends on the United States being able to tell the Ukrainians to stop. That's an awful lot of ifs.
And the Russians do, well, who are we talking about when we say the Russians? Vladimir Putin, the Russian military, ordinary Russians on the street, they view Crimea as actually part of Russia. That's not just propaganda or nationalist bluster.
No, that is true of the overwhelming majority of Russians, and certainly the Russian military, far more than any other area of Ukraine. There are differences in the Russian population. Of course, there are a certain number of Russian liberals who would be willing to give it up, but they're very, very limited. Even one of the old liberals, Yavlinsky, has basically come out in the Crimea is part of Russia.
Well, as you say in your article in Jacobin, between Crimea's 1783 conquest by Catherine the Great from the Ottoman Empire and its 1954 transfer to Ukraine by Soviet decree, so we should blame Khrushchev for this, Crimea was part of Russia until the latter date, 54. At no point in Crimea's history had it been part of Ukraine. So we have some historical
of course,
here.
That doesn't mean that it was part of Russia before 1783.
Yeah. Well, everyone's looking for a usable history here.
Yeah, but certainly it was never part of Ukraine.
So, 1 year of war. What has surprised you about this first year? What have we learned about modern warfare that maybe we should have known but forgot? Most people, most observers thought Russia would win the war easily and would have been over by now.
Yes, I had a slightly different view. I didn't expect the Russians to try to capture Kiev. I was certain that the Ukrainians would there resist very, very strongly, and also that Russia simply couldn't govern central and western Ukraine. But I thought Russian intelligence would be good enough for them to know that, and that they would then concentrate successfully on conquering the whole of the east and south of the country, in other words, the Russian-speaking areas. So, as you say, the vast majority of analysts, I was astonished by the extent of the Russian defeat, or defeats, in the first weeks of the war. And so much has been made, quite rightly, of the disastrous failures of Russian strategy, which is obviously based on dreadfully poor intelligence, or if there was good intelligence that was simply ignored or overruled by Putin. Attacking from 7 different directions with only 200,000 men, a country of 230,000 square miles with 40 million people. It was just contrary to every principle of good strategy.
There are problems with the Russian command system, their tactics, the strategy, hubris. There's been some really good reporting in recent weeks and months about what went wrong for Russia. Pretty much everything. They didn't do an initial bombardment. They didn't establish air superiority. They were shooting at the wrong targets. The Ukrainians were nimble. The Russians weren't. We can go on all day about this.
They hadn't even sorted out coordination between their air power and their ground forces. They've known there's been a problem ever since the Russian-Georgian War of 2008. Their logistics and staff work were appalling. But, like the lack of numbers, I think some of this does go back to Putin's political calculations. He wouldn't launch mass conscription, not just before the war, but for 7 months into the war, clearly because he was worried about the reaction in the Russian public. Well, I think one must suspect that the reason why he didn't crazily appoint a commander-in-chief for the invasion was that he feared the emergence of a victorious general who might then challenge him for power. But when all that's said, I think there are also some wider lessons for contemporary warfare in general, because what did also very much emerge was the critical factor of morale. Morale, will to fight, discipline. Because, and I saw this myself when I covered the first Chechen war in 94 to 96. Troops, well, certainly if armed with modern anti-tank weapons like the Javelin, but even armed with rocket-propelled grenades, can do terrible damage to armored forces, to tanks and infantry fighting vehicles in urban areas. And even after those areas have been heavily bombarded, because you can hide in the ruins. But of course, it takes tremendous courage, nerve, to do that. So what we've learned is, I think, the tremendous effectiveness of anti-tank weapons, of handheld anti-aircraft missiles, the Stingers, but also actually, most of the anti-aircraft missiles used by the Ukrainians were old Soviet ones, but still very effective. But, as a British sergeant said in a famous film about, the importance of weaponry, it also takes some guts.
And there's been reporting in the New York Times, for instance, about Russian conscripts with hardly any training, don't know how to fire a rifle, bad maps, outdated maps, old equipment. I couldn't believe it when I read that they're using equipment from the 1940s. For the average Russian conscript, why do they want to fight in this war, while the Ukrainian is fighting for his homeland?
Yeah, absolutely. Though Putin has...
And sorry to interrupt, but that should not have been a surprise to anyone. But people did try to warn Putin, too, some of the reporting that's come out, and he didn't want to listen.
Well, that's it. And, it is reminiscent in some ways, but obviously in a much more disastrous form, of the Bush administration before the invasion of Iraq. They were warned.
By Russia.
Amongst others, but, also by American experts. But they made up their mind they didn't want to. They didn't want to listen.
Christopher Caldwell, writing an essay, op-ed, they call it an essay now in the New York Times, says, the problem is that Ukraine is losing the war. He was writing about how the United States and others are going to start sending tanks to Ukraine to help them win. He says Ukraine is losing the war. Russia has much more manpower, resources, etc. And Caldwell argues this is kind of a bogged down, I'm not sure I agree with this, but he says it's a bogged down World War I style battle of attrition, and that only favors the Russians. I mean, is it possible a year into this to say, Anatol, who is winning and winning what?
Well, in terms of Russian ambitions and Western expectations as of a year ago, but also, in terms of the history of the past 400 years of Russian domination of Ukraine, there's no doubt at all who's won so far. It's been the Ukrainians. They beat the Russians outside Kiev, prevented them from capturing Kiev and dominating the whole of Ukraine. They beat the Russians outside Kharkov, prevented them from capturing Ukraine's second city. Even in the Donbass, the Russians have not captured the whole of the Donbass, and they pinned them down west of the Dnieper River and eventually forced them out from Kherson, meaning that there's no longer a Russian threat to capture the Ukrainian Black Sea coast. I mean, that is a succession of tremendous victories. Yeah, I mean, it is rather like the First World War, thousands and thousands of casualties, hundreds of thousands of shells being expended for villages and small towns that nobody, I think probably most people even in Ukraine, had ever heard of, until last year. But, I mean, it's true that in that kind of war, the superior Russian resources can wear down the Ukrainians. But on the other hand, of course, once again, to go back to the First World War, all the way from 1914 to 1918 on the Western Front, put together, the Western Allies had superiority over the Germans. But, attacking heavily defended positions with men on the other side who were willing to stand their ground, of course, did damage to Britain and France, from which, in many ways, they've never recovered.
That's right. Yeah, the World War I comparisons are a little bit off. I mean, modern tactics are different. We have modern weaponry. I mean, tanks were not decisive in World War I. They were in their infancy. We have modern aircraft here, although for some reason the Russians haven't been able to use their advantage in aircraft. I guess what I'm saying is the World War I comparisons can only go so far.
Oh, surely. But then, it is also true that the Russian superiority in aircraft and in armor, and remember, it was absolutely overwhelming before the war, proved to be much, much less effective and successful than most people thought.
Absolutely.
And remember that the Russians have lost an awful lot of their best equipment and their best men over the past year. Does it also indicate something about one of these periodic shifts in warfare, where at one point in the late 17th century, the defensive had a tremendous advantage because of you basically having to batter down endless interlinked fortresses. Then, of course, after the French Revolution, the offensive became so powerful. Then, in the First World War, of course, the defensive, because of changes in technology, became so effective. Then, of course, in the Second World War, blitzkrieg, tanks, aircraft, the offensive recovered. But, on the other hand, these were much poorer, of course, armies. But the Indians and the Pakistanis in 1965 basically fought each other to a standstill, and their armored forces were nullified on both sides by urban areas, canals and rivers which they couldn't get across, and troops on the defensive with good artillery support.
I see your point. We could be seeing a change here that the tank is less important than...
Maybe.
Is the U.S. a co-belligerent now, or has it been?
Well, I'm not enough of an international lawyer.
Well, you said the Abrams. That's why I'm bringing this up. We're giving the Ukrainians more and more powerful equipment that a year ago we said we wouldn't be giving them, but it's turned into that.
Well, was the Soviet Union and where China co-belligerents of North Vietnam during the Vietnamese War?
You can make an argument that they were.
Yeah, you can indeed. And yet, of course, America backed off attacking them directly, although there were advocates of doing that. I mean, similarly in Korea, where actually Soviet fighter pilots apparently were in action over Korea. But the Chinese were allies, of course, of the North Koreans. But I think, if you take those examples, we are not quite there yet, but we are getting close. And certainly, I do think it was, of course, one cannot say for sure who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. But given that the Russians had absolutely no motive to do so, well, I mean, obviously there must be suspicions. And I do think that was not a sensible thing to do, because it more or less invites an asymmetrical Russian response, and blowing up important bits of international infrastructure, particularly ones which were paralyzed already and inactive, because, of course, the Germans had cut it off.
That's right.
This strikes me as a horribly dangerous precedent, frankly.
One more question about what's happening now before we touch on some of these larger issues. As I've reflected on the past year, I've been puzzled by the timing of Russia's invasion, as in why February 22? What happened leading up to that date, or why that date, Anatol?
Why February? As opposed to waiting to the early summer.
Yeah, or why 2022 and not, say, 2014?
Well, there you see, I mean, that is actually rather interesting, because, and this, by the way, is what the Russian hardliners have been saying first in private and now in public ever since to Putin. Look, why didn't you invade the whole of Ukraine in 2014? The Ukrainian army was very weak. You had a democratically elected president, Yanukovych, who you could have reinstalled, if not in Kiev, at least in, Kharkiv or Odessa. And there were certain actions on the Ukrainian side, the massacre of pro-Russian protesters in Odessa, for example, which, gave you a casus belli. The answer, I think, is Putin was warned by Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and by the French government, that if Russia had done that, well, it would have been like what's happened this year, or last year, that it would have been the end of minimally good relations and economic relations between Russia and Western Europe. Not just economically, but politically too. Ever since the 1990s, Yeltsin regime, it's been a cardinal point of the mainstream of the Russian foreign and security establishment, not just Putin, to try to divide France and Germany from the United States. I mean, not completely, but sufficiently ultimately to be able to do what Dmitry Medvedev tried to do when he was interim president, which was to create a new European security order in which Russia would be an equal partner with France and Germany, and America would, to some extent, distanced. That was kept alive, basically, despite many disappointments, for years and years, because there was always just enough on the other side to keep it alive. There was Germany and France opposing the invasion of Iraq. There was Germany and France in 2008 opposing a NATO membership action plan for Ukraine. And then the election of Trump made the Russians think maybe there is going to open up this gulf, political, cultural gulf between America and Europe, which will once again give us a chance. Now, in the year or so before the invasion of Ukraine, various things happened. Well, firstly, of course, there was the election of Joe Biden. I've heard Russian analysts say that if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016, Russia would have invaded in 2018, 4 years earlier, because they would have reckoned that there was nothing more to hope for. But then, you see, there were various things. There was the fact that, Germany and France negotiated the Minsk II agreement in 2015, which led to an unstable ceasefire in the Donbass, and which was supposed to lead to the Donbass going back to Ukraine, but as an autonomous region. Well, the Ukrainians refused ever to implement that, and the West did nothing to get them.
Yeah. And just reading here, Anatol, from a New York Times piece from December, a profile on Vladimir Putin and the events from 2014 to 2022. It says, when Mr. Zelensky was elected in a landslide in 2019, the Kremlin saw him as someone it could work with. A Russian-speaking comedian who had lived in Moscow, performed on Russian TV, and won with a message of ending the war in eastern Ukraine that Russia had fueled. But by early 2021, the Kremlin's hopes had been dashed. Mr. Zelensky cracked down on pro-Russian interests in Ukraine, shutting down pro-Russian TV channels and sanctioning Viktor Medvedchuk, a Ukrainian oligarch close to Mr. Putin. So I suppose what this suggests is the Russian leadership was looking for a way out of the jam it had started in 2014.
Well, the thing is that the Kremlin did have considerable hopes of Zelensky, because Zelensky, after all, is Russian-speaking. He's Jewish, so not a Ukrainian ethnic nationalist, or at least he wasn't until the war. And he was elected on a platform of seeking peace and dialogue with Russia. But it soon became apparent that the Ukrainian, radical nationalists would simply not allow this. From Russia's point of view, Zelensky just folded. He did not pursue that agenda. But then you see there were other things as well. There was the US-Ukrainian Security Pact, or Partnership of November, which of course was not an alliance, but implied even greater US military help to Ukraine. There was the Ukrainian water blockade of Crimea, because Crimea gets the great majority of its water via a canal from the Dnieper River, which the Ukrainians had blocked, and this was doing tremendous damage to Crimean agriculture in particular, but also the Crimean tourist industry, the Crimean economy. Finally, Russia issued this ultimatum in December. There was the issue of Russian language rights in Ukraine. There were more and more moves to end the Russian language in higher education, close down the Russian media. You mentioned Medvedchuk. I mean, that was a move, both against the pro-Russian political opposition in Ukraine, but also a move to control the media and end Russian influence in the media.
So Putin decides war is the way to resolve these issues. Obviously, a massive miscalculation and a crime.
Well, totally.
And a crime.
And a crime. I mean, because, of course, this is the problem. Explaining all the reasons why Russia did this. I was trained as a historian. I mean, explaining why Germany went to war in 1914 does not mean justifying the invasion of Belgium, or let alone the atrocities that were committed in the course of this. But it is, after all, the job both of a historian and of an analyst to explain why other governments acted in the way that
Exactly.
they did.
Well, today's debased political discourse, if you talk about these things, you're pro-Russian or making excuses. It's obviously not what we're doing. So on that note, and I'll just say this before I even go further, I mean, some of this can seem out of touch, right? There's a war going on, and some might say, well, what does it matter now? Bullets have been fired and blood has been spilled. But how can we understand how we got here, let alone what to do next, if we can't accurately assess motivations, right, and causation? So I've seen two main arguments about causation. One is simple Russian imperialism. Putin and his ruling circle embrace an ideological history that says Ukraine is part of Russia. Russia is an expansionist power, as Stephen Kotkin, the great historian, put it. What we have today in Russia is not some kind of surprise. It's not some kind of deviation from a historical pattern. Way before NATO existed, he told The New Yorker in this interview, in the 19th century, Russia looked like this. It had an autocrat, it had repression, it had militarism, it had suspicion of foreigners in the West. This is a Russia that we know, and it's not a Russia that arrived yesterday or in the 1990s, referring to NATO expansion. So that's one, Anatol. The other main argument that I see is Russia is pursuing what it perceives are its security interests. However, criminally, with a war, this argument takes into account decades of Russian objections to NATO expansion and what it views as U.S. hegemonic behavior. So rather than dismissing Putin's public objections to NATO, I think he mentioned NATO 40 times in that speech he gave before the start of the war, objections about NATO and the West as mere propaganda cover for base imperialist motives, this argument takes Russian objections seriously. And also there's geopolitics as well. I mentioned the Black Sea is very important to Russia. So what does Professor Anatol say? These things are not mutually exclusive, right?
Exactly. That's my point. All of the above is true. But I think what one does need to point out is that there are different streams in the Russian tradition. Undoubtedly, there is this anti-Western stream. The belief that Russia must be a great power is as much of a doctrine or dogma in the Russian security establishment as the belief in American global primacy is in the American establishment. But, I mean, in the 90s, one must remember that when you had a much more pro-Western Russian government, under Yeltsin, it was also firmly opposed to NATO expansion and determined to retain not absolute control, not annexed, but a degree of predominant Russian influence in Ukraine. One has to remember that the most liberal and pro-Western Russian foreign minister that Russia has ever had, Andrei Kozyrev, warned repeatedly that for the West to pursue, this program of basically the expansion of Western power at Russia's expense was going to wreck relations between Russia and the West. Now, he was not arguing, and so many Russian liberals I knew in those days said the same thing, arguing not from a nationalist or imperialist standpoint, but just saying Western actions will ruin liberalism within Russia.
George Kennan made similar arguments about Ukraine. Also, the current head of the CIA, as we know, made a warning about this some years ago, Burns.
Well, in his memo to the State Department when he was ambassador to Moscow. You see, the problem about the Kotkin line is, like so many of these lines, it absolves the West and America of all responsibility. If the other side is entirely evil, is unchanging, is perennially, permanently anti-Western and imperialist, well, then it doesn't matter what we do. But actually, of course, it does. I mean, Putin tried from, of course, the standpoint as he saw it of Russian interests, but still, several times to establish a good relationship with the United States. Now, this required, of course, the United States being willing to make concessions, which it was never willing to make. But the point is, what we do also affects the way that other people behave. And in the case of Russia, unfortunately, I mean, it also affects, because Russian liberalism is associated with pro-Western positions, it has affected and very, very badly damaged the cause of pro-Western liberalism within Russia.
Yet Ukraine does have a special place in all of this. This would not apply to Poland, the Baltic states. We're talking about these factors, these forces, combined with Russia's desire to dominate Ukraine, or at least not have it go off to the West, which of course is wrong. Ukrainians have chosen their own path. It is not 1650 or 1750 or 1950 anymore.
Yes, although, I mean, one must also point out, that up to 2014, every opinion poll, including ones commissioned by the West, showed more than 2/3 of Ukrainians opposed to NATO membership for Ukraine. They were in favor of membership of the European Union with all its benefits. Membership, though, not sort of some endless succession process. So when America and Britain tried to push through a membership action plan for Ukraine, for NATO, in 2008, they were doing so, clearly against the will of a very large majority of Ukrainians. The great majority of the Ukrainians who were saying no to NATO, it wasn't that they wanted to be dominated by Russia, certainly didn't want to join Russia, but they had close connections to Russia. One forgets that even today, I mean, one of the ironies is if you know these two languages, you see lots and lots and lots of Russian nationalists with Ukrainian names and, Russian officials, just as you see an awful lot of Ukrainian nationalists now with Russian surnames. The two populations, are heavily intermarried, and, up until 2014 and even after, millions of Ukrainians migrated to Russia for work.
And there was also a feeling that the Donbass might be better off going to Russia, or at least having autonomy within a sovereign Ukraine, that it wasn't worth fighting a war over?
Well, I mean, one of the tragedies is that, until 2014, when this, of course, became a matter of national pride and resistance to Russian aggression, but until then, you would find actually precisely more radical Ukrainian nationalists and ethnic nationalists saying, oh, for God's sake, we should let Crimea and the Donbass go. They were never really part of Ukraine. And of course, if you can get rid of them with their Russian majorities, we'll be in a much, much stronger position to move towards the West, to develop an independent, Ukrainian national culture.
And that's how it was working, actually, for a bit. That's how Ukraine made some progress on that front.
This is also where Putin's policy in 2014 was crazy, because if you wanted to keep influence over Ukraine, you needed to keep the Donbass and Crimea within Ukraine. So much of what Ukraine has been able to do since 2014 has precisely been because millions of pro-Russians were no longer voting in Ukrainian elections. You could never have introduced these measures against the Russian language in Ukraine if an additional 5 million Russian speakers had been within the country.
How about that? Robert Kagan, a historian. He doesn't like the term neoconservative, but he was on my podcast recently discussing his new book about American foreign policy. He recently wrote an essay about the same time his book was published in Foreign Affairs, which is the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. He said, none of the great powers behave as the realists suggest, guided by rational judgments about maximizing security. Like great powers in the past, they act out of beliefs and passions, angers and resentments. There are no separate state interests. No separate state interests, he says. Only the interests and beliefs of the people who inhabit and rule states. He went on to say that Putin has damaged Russian security, not for reasons having to do with security or economics or any material gains, but instead to overcome the humiliation of lost greatness, to satisfy his sense of his place in Russian history, and perhaps to defend a certain set of beliefs. So my take on that, in other words, is Putin crossed the Rubicon over an abstraction, over emotions.
Well, I think there I hear the neocon speaking. It's interesting how Kagan, who is, of course, also married to Victoria Nuland, says that it's what the rulers believe. This is very much the belief that there are elites with ideologies and ideals who then dominate and lead their countries. Well, there are two questions here. One is the extent to which those views are shared by the population in general. The second is whether, at the same time, there are real security issues. And, undoubtedly, the security issues for Russia in Ukraine would be immediately recognizable to an honest American strategist looking at American security interests in Mexico and Central America, as has often been said.
That doesn't mean you agree necessarily with the Russian outlook here.
No, but the other thing about Kagan is, and he actually said this in another, was it in this essay? I can't remember, recently, saying that none of America's wars have been fought for actually to defend the American homeland or
that same essay, yes.
Is that the way a majority of Americans see this? Is that the way that the neocons have sold? Well, not just the neocons, but American administrations have sold American wars to the American people. The weird thing is that by saying that, Kagan was basically making an ultra-isolationist line. Elites in Washington, and elsewhere, who launch wars for ideological reasons that are not in the interests of ordinary Americans or of American security. And the conclusion you could draw from that is, if you were an ordinary American citizen, okay, Bob, you go off to fight, sure, but why are you trying to, drag my kids off for your ideological wars? And by the way, I would say exactly the same thing to Putin if I were a Russian parent.
Well, he argues that World War I was about ideology, and that's how this war is being framed from an American point of view. How do you feel about that, Anatol? Is the war in Ukraine about ideology?
Well, to some extent it is, yes. But as various people have pointed out, the First World War was thoroughly ambiguous from that point of view. When America entered the war, it was doing so as an ally of Tsarist Russia, which was not a democracy. And, of course, the British and French empires, which, however they were governed at home, were certainly not democracies in Ireland, let alone Vietnam or India. But also, of course, look, America entered the war because two things, because Germany was torpedoing American ships going to Europe without warning. And America was afraid that Germany was wearing down the other side, which, by the way, turned out to be true, to the point where if America did not intervene, Germany would win the war in Europe. And then, as after 1940, you would have a hostile or potentially hostile great power dominating the eastern coast of the Atlantic. And of course, in 1941, you would also have a hostile great power, Japan, dominating the western littoral of the Pacific. So there were, also excellent American security reasons for entering those wars. But once again, I mean, this is not an either-or question. I mean, obviously, ideology also did play a part.
Yeah. There are problems, though, at least in my view, with elevating the war to a level of cosmic importance for U.S. democracy. The autocracy versus democracy framing, as if the world can be divided into two camps. Because as you know, President Obama in 2016 said Ukraine is not a core U.S. interest. Well, we certainly are acting as it is, and not just for the principle of the defense of national territory, which is what Ukrainians are fighting for. The way this is being framed, not just by the Biden administration, but by public intellectuals and even historians in our own country, is that the fate of Ukrainian democracy will affect American democracy.
That, for me, is fundamentally false. I mean, just look at it logically. If this were true, why was Ukraine so completely irrelevant to all these issues for the past 250 years, when American democracy seemed to be doing fine, right, while ignoring Ukraine and mostly Russia too? Totally. And during the Cold War, of course, look, during the Cold War, at least in its first stages, Soviet communism was a threat, undoubtedly, to Western democracy, no question whatsoever. But that was because the Soviet army was in Germany, in the middle of Germany, in the middle of Europe, because Soviet communism was threatening to take over the former French and British empires as they broke up and became independent. Now, absolutely. But Ukraine? No. But the other thing, of course, is, heavens, God, we've had enough lessons in this, how very, very dangerous it is for democracy and internal peace and civic rights and freedom of the press to associate domestic political rivals with foreign enemies. I mean, I have many, many, many problems with Donald Trump, but the suggestion that your president is actually a traitor in the pay, directed by a foreign power, is a charge, which should never have been made, or at least not unless you had proof positive that this was the case. And undoubtedly now, the idea of association with Russia and China is being used for domestic American political reasons in a way that I find profoundly illegitimate. I mean, not just illegitimate in democratic political terms, but also because, both in America and in Europe, it's intellectually false. I mean, if you look at the reasons why, in France, for example, Front National, the National Front as it used to be called, has gained more and more votes. For God's sake, don't look at Moscow. Ask their voters. It's to do with crime. It's to do with illegal immigration. It's to do with, all the things we know about in America too. It's to do with a perception of the corruption of the elites and the indifference of the elites.
Anatol, in my view, there's no question that the Biden administration sees U.S. support for Ukraine as an opportunity to shape the international environment again. As Robert Kagan put it in his essay, he wrote, "The liberal world order will be threatened if Ukraine falls." I often wonder about folks who push this argument, if they consider the fact or the possibility that prolonging the war can also threaten the liberal world order. If we're going to use World War I as a comparison, can anyone argue that prolonging that war for 4+ years worked out well for anybody, even the victors?
Well, absolutely. And we don't know how things will go. There is the danger of escalation. And also, of course, there is the fact that Ukraine is being progressively ruined. But the other thing to point out is that people like Kagan, as in the piece you quoted, keep saying, if Ukraine falls. Well, I don't think that there is any danger that most of Ukraine and the Ukrainian state now will fall to Russia. I think that danger ceased to exist actually just a few weeks into the invasion. What we are now talking about is battles for limited amounts of territory in eastern and southern Ukraine. And most of Ukraine now, I think there's no question whatsoever, it is already de facto a partner of the West. And whether it will be able to move towards membership of the European Union in future actually depends very heavily on ending the war, because it can't begin to do that until the war ends. But also, of course, after that, it will depend on Ukraine's own capacity for domestic reform. We will have to see. But this notion that this is still an apocalyptic struggle, you could make that argument, you know, back in February, March of last year. But that argument for me is over. This is a limited post-colonial battle for limited amounts of territory. By the way, I mean, it's also worth pointing out that even, you know, left-wing, democratic, progressive intellectuals in places like India, South Africa, Brazil, they don't see it in these terms at all.
Now, the global South does not buy into this kind of Cold War era thinking. Capital W West versus Moscow.
Well, they see it as a proxy war between two imperialisms.
I'll leave you with this final question, comment. What concerns me the most is, as we know from history, what is the reality today can change rather quickly. The war can escalate again. It does not look like Vladimir Putin and his ruling circle are in any mood to negotiate at all. In other words, I don't see negotiations happening anytime soon.
Well, I mean, the thing is...
I don't know what I'm talking about, Anatol.
Well, look, I mean, in the end, none of us do, because we're not inside Putin's head. You know, the people I know in Moscow who used to be insiders, not in the core regime, but, you know, they've all been expelled, you know, in recent years, the tremendous narrowing of the Putin regime. But there is talk that by now, because of the colossal casualties and losses and the absence of prospect for complete victory, that Putin would settle for much, much less. That if they can conquer the whole of the Donbass, that Russia would offer a ceasefire. If that's true, you know, this is not Putin aiming at total victory anymore. He's looking for a compromise peace, but of course on Russian terms. And the Russian terms, which would be undoubtedly recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, amongst other things, of course are not acceptable to the Ukrainians and the West. So I think you're right up to a point, but you know, the issues are still more limited, and it is possible at some stage that simple exhaustion on both sides will bring about, if not a peace settlement, at least a ceasefire, just because the two sides will not be able to go on fighting anymore.
Yes, in wars past, belligerents do arrive at a point where the war isn't pointless, but it is pointless to keep fighting. To continue fighting over the same territory, a la World War I, becomes existentially pointless. You know, if these casualty estimates are true, each side losing 100,000 men already. It's far worse for Ukraine, which is a much smaller country.
But, you know, I mean, as you were talking about, these wretched Russian conscripts, you know, badly trained, poorly equipped, and, you know, that is also because so much of the best troops and the best equipment was destroyed in the first months of the war.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to turn our focus back on the United States and take a look at the rise of evangelical Christianity on the right in U.S. politics. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.